Vatniks, start drying your crackers and boiling jellied meat from army boots. The economic collapse of the Moscow pseudo-empire is coming. The collapse will be on such a scale that the 1998 default and the late Soviet Union's famine will seem like a sweet dream.
By the end of 2024, the Russian economy has reached the limits of its capabilities.
In Chelyabinsk, the number of stores and markets selling expired food is growing. The main customers at these places are pensioners.
13,500 is enough for me. I pay 8 of that for my apartment. And that's enough for everything.
Enough?
Just a joke.
The Russian trough has already critically taken on filth overboard and is going under. Moreover, instead of bailing out the situation, the pale geostrategist is, on the contrary, loading the sinking vessel with even more military spending.
In the budget for 2025, spending on the war against Ukraine has risen to record levels. That is, according to the Kremlin's very optimistic forecasts, the budget deficit is over 1 trillion rubles.
Not even ending the war can save Putinomics now, although it would slightly soften the blow of the fall. But in the Kremlin, the alternatively gifted conquerors aren't even considering this option, and on the contrary, are ramping up military spending, constantly increasing payments to mercenaries and overpaying hundreds of middlemen tenfold for electronics meant for washing machines. In other words, there are no super unique missiles. As a result, Muscovy has found itself on the brink of a financial collapse of biblical proportions.
The Russian Federation is on the threshold of a very big crisis. Our war expenses are much higher than the budget there. In the budget, remember, 1/4 is military expenses. In fact, these expenses are much greater.
By the end of 2024, all leading global economic analysts had given Russia a fatal diagnosis: a looming, massive credit crisis that not even Nabulina can plug anymore. According to American financial analyst Craig Kennedy, one of the reasons for the approaching apocalypse is Putin's blatant fraud and his attempt to conceal the real costs of the war. Official Russian military expenditures account for 1/4 of the entire national budget. But even this colossal amount of public money is far from enough. This is confirmed even by the combat orcs themselves.
For 3 years, no one could figure out why our soldiers are without underwear and have to beg for it. And I even showed a segment, I think I did, where they were sent dirty underwear. The soldiers were outraged that they had been sent dirty, smelly, unwashed underwear.
It's impossible to find money from outside because of the sanctions. All the petrodollars have already been spent on meat grinder assaults and entertainment content for TNT. But just so that Russians' brains, God forbid, don't start working and asking unnecessary questions.
Everything is fine. Everything is absolutely safe. There is no panic at all.
That's why the so-called brilliant Kremlin economists came up with an incredible trick: how to increase military spending in such a way that no one would notice. Putin has forcibly required commercial banks to issue loans to the defense industry. In other words, the thug literally takes out a loan from the bank to build Shaheeds and weld a metal bed frame for drones onto a Zhiguli car.
Now, repaying this significant corporate debt, which has accordingly reached a level of 19.4% of GDP, that's over $400 billion, of which approximately 210 to 250 billion are purely military loans. And this, according to Craig Kennedy, creates the risk of a credit crisis. Quite simply, the companies that are working for the war effort are unable to repay these loans, which were issued by banks under pressure.
Naturally, no one is going to pay back these forced loans. The defense industry is operating at a loss and simply wouldn't be able to pay off its debts in 150 years, because the products they make are either fired from cannons or destroyed by Ukrainian drones along with the crew, for whom they then have to pay 12 million in death benefits.
This creates a kind of bluff, a false impression that our economic system is very robust. But in reality, as Craig Kennedy proves, the Russian Federation is walking on the edge of an abyss.
In normal countries, a client like Putin wouldn't even be given credit to buy a microwave. But in Russia, where the laws of economics and logic don't apply, anything is possible. Naturally, it will be the state that repays these dead loans in order to save the banks and prevent the military-industrial complex from collapsing. As a result, the additional military expenses still fall on the state budget, but now with interest on top.
Wonderful. Amazing. Brilliant!
Taking into account the forced loans, Moscow's actual war expenses may be twice the official defense budget. In other words, that's a full 50% of the entire federal budget. Every other ruble in Russia is being spent on war crimes. The size of the secret military budget is estimated to be about $83 billion each year. That's approximately $228 million every single day. So in 3 years, the Kremlin has spent 300 billion greenbacks on a senseless bloodbath. That's more than the annual GDP of Greece, Qatar, and Hungary.
Money isn't a problem. They simply don't have any.
Now, do you understand why people in Taganrog don't live like they do in Qatar? Because 1.5 times Qatar's budget was spent on repairing Soviet MTLBs and producing ammunition. And also on prosthetics for war criminals. And of course, on electric scooters for elite disposable assault units. What do you think Russia would look like if, for example, they spent $226 million every single day on urban development? Just imagine that.
What kind of bus is that? That's a hospital, important local building for medical care.
Maybe we'll end up flying on it.
Here we are, saving countries, bombing them. But really, we don't even need to be bombed. We're all here. Vanya's car is standing here. We've already blown everything up ourselves here.
By the way, forcibly taking money from banks for defense isn't some new invention. Putin first pulled this stunt back in the 2010s, when he decided to put on a show with rearming the military. There wasn't enough money in the treasury for that, so they decided to go wild with preferential bank loans. In total, bankers were squeezed for 20 trillion rubles for the state armament program. With that money, they promised to deliver divisions of Armata tanks to the troops, hundreds of modern airplanes, and thousands of helicopters. In the end, all these achievements remained only on paper. The Armata tank died right on Red Square, and the 5th-generation superfighter Su-57, cobbled together from construction debris, became a laughingstock at the exhibition in China.
Literally every observer noted such an abundance of rivets sticking out of the fuselage. Clearly shows that the assembly of the aircraft simply no longer meets modern standards. And furthermore, some observers say that such artifacts also raise doubts about the aircraft's coating, which is specifically supposed to absorb radio waves.
Generals and officials happily sewed up 20 trillion. Military enterprises never saw the money and produced nothing. Accordingly, they didn't sell anything either, which means they had nothing to pay back their loans with.
You see, Golf.
No.
Neither do I. But it's there.
So the pseudo-government simply had to write off the loans for the defense factories. It was only thanks to incredible oil prices and well-developed economic ties with the West that the financial collapse was avoided. But today, that trick won't work. Now things will be much worse.
Now, God willing, the total income for the year for 2025 will be $260 billion in total export revenue. That's counting everything, raw materials, machinery, machine exports, and so on, though that's not much for us. At the peak in 2011, we had $560 billion. Our revenues have dropped dramatically.
Issuing loans to insolvent defense industry enterprises will lead to a systemic credit crisis. What happens to banks that don't get their loans repaid? Billions in loans. These banks cease to exist. And after them, everything else will collapse like dominoes. And then who will finance Putin's operations? That's right, 140 million serfs.
That's why there's less foreign currency. They'll convert it into more rubles by devaluing the currency. Another way is to take money from the population. Everyone in Russia has panicked, saying any moment they'll freeze our deposits.
Russians will have even their last pair of pants taken away to keep the war going. Putin is going all in not just with the last of the money, but with money that isn't even his anymore. And if anyone thinks this is just fantasy, that the state can't just take people's money, let us remind you, the Kremlin has already done this at the end of the Soviet Union. And back then, the USSR wasn't even fighting a continental war.
Compared to today's Russia, Brezhnev's Soviet Union was a kingdom of pure reason. I never thought I'd ever say that in my life. But the Soviet Union was very cunning in how it operated. It sold oil and gas to the West, got money, and then used that money to fight the West by funding anti-Western regimes. But it was a very clever model. Putin has lost Western funding and is now trying to fight the West without their money, relying only on funds from India and China. That's not reliable now.
The Soviet system collapsed, along with oil prices. But things are even worse for Russia now. New sanctions are limiting Moscow's ability to trade hydrocarbons at all. Their shadow fleet is finally being dealt with seriously. Now, dozens of Putin's tankers are drifting in the ocean, unable to find a port that will accept them. Even Chinese and Indian partners don't want to get involved with this foul-smelling, spiritually bound oil.
According to Kepler, which is a company that closely monitors and tracks ship movements, 3 Russian tankers that have come under US sanctions are currently located in the waters of eastern China. On board, they are carrying more than 2 million barrels of Siberian ISPO crude oil. All 3 tankers left the port of Kozmino at the beginning of the year, but later changed course and are now anchored off the coast.
And oil is the main source of revenue for the neo-empire's budget. It was precisely the flow of petrodollars that provided the Kremlin with money for mercenaries, for banned imports, for weapons production, and for bribing useful idiots in the West.
I would like to remind you that this video is created for entertainment purposes and contains elements of satire and irony. All facts and events are presented in a hyperbolized or exaggerated form to convey a comedic or dramatic effect. Our goal is not to mislead, but to highlight humor. Please take it with a smile.